The morning was quiet, too quiet. Karen stood at her kitchen window, staring at the golden sunlight spilling over her garden. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, and birds sang in the trees. It was the kind of morning that should have felt peaceful. But deep in her chest, Karen felt a knot of unease she couldn't explain. Something was coming. She gripped her coffee cup tighter, her knuckles whitening. The harder she tried to shake the feeling, the louder the memories became. Explosions, gunfire, screams. She wasn't there anymore. She knew that. But some days the past clung to her like a shadow. "You're safe now," Karen whispered to herself. "It's just another morning." She grabbed her gloves and headed to the garden, hoping the routine would silence the storm inside her. Kneeling in the soft dirt, she focused on her work. Grab, pull, toss. The earthy smell was rich and real, grounding her. But the peace shattered in an instant. A sharp crack split the air, a car backfiring in the distance. Karen froze. The sound wasn't just loud, it was too familiar. Her breath caught, and the tools slipped from her hands. She dropped to her knees, pressing her palms over her ears. Suddenly, she wasn't in her garden anymore. She was back in the chaos. Smoke filled her lungs. Shadows moved through the dust. The metallic taste of fear coated her tongue. "You're home," she told herself through clenched teeth. "You're safe." But her hands kept shaking. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Karen busied herself with small, mindless tasks, cleaning, organizing, anything to distract herself. By evening, she was exhausted, her nerves frayed. Then came the pounding at her door. The sound was urgent, almost frantic, shaking the frame. Karen's heart jumped as she hesitated. Through the peephole, she saw her neighbor, Sophie Collins, tears streaming down her face. Karen opened the door cautiously, and Sophie nearly collapsed inside. "Please!" Sophie's voice was trembling, her words spilling out between sobs. "It's Maya. She's having her puppies, but something's wrong. I don't know what to do." Sophie's hands were shaking. "I heard you used to be a medic," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, you're the only one who can help." Karen's mind screamed at her to retreat, to let someone else handle it. But Sophie's desperation was impossible to ignore. "Let me grab my bag," Karen said, swallowing her fear. As she followed Sophie to her house, Karen's unease grew. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong, and what she would find there would change everything. Karen followed Sophie into the small house, her heart pounding. The air inside was thick with worry, and the faint smell of wet dog lingered. In the corner of the room, Maya lay on a worn blanket, her massive body heaving with each labored breath. The German shepherd's wide, dark eyes were full of pain, her ears twitching at every sound. Karen's pulse quickened. For a moment, she stood frozen, her mind slipping to another time and place. She wasn't in Sophie's house anymore. She was back in the field, surrounded by smoke and chaos. But Maya's soft whimper pulled her back to the present. Karen forced herself to kneel beside the dog. "I'm here, girl," she murmured, her voice steadying as she reached into her medical bag. Her hands shook as she pulled out her tools, but she willed herself to focus. Sophie hovered nearby, wringing her hands. "I should have called sooner," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what to do." "You did the right thing," Karen interrupted gently, "but we need to act fast now." Maya let out another soft cry, her body shuddering with effort. Karen stroked the dog's head, grounding herself in the familiar motions. "That's it, sweet girl. You're doing great." Karen's military training kicked in as she quickly assessed the situation. The contractions were strong, and the signs of labor were clear, but Maya's tense body hinted at trouble. "Sophie," Karen said, her voice calm but firm, "I need clean towels and warm water." Quickly. Sophie nodded and darted to the kitchen, her footsteps echoing through the quiet house. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Karen worked methodically. She matched her breathing to Maya's, using the rhythm to stay grounded. Finally, the first puppy began to emerge. Karen leaned in closer, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. But when she lifted the tiny body into her hands, her breath caught. The puppy's fur was covered in angry red lesions, some of them oozing with discharge. Karen felt her stomach twist. "What's wrong?" Sophie asked as she returned, clutching the towels. Karen's hands were steady, but her voice faltered slightly. I don't know yet, she admitted, wrapping the puppy in a clean towel. But we need to isolate this one. Whatever this is, it might be contagious. Maya shuddered again as another contraction gripped her body. The second puppy came moments later, and it bore the same unsettling marks. Karen's chest tightened as she fought to keep her composure. She quickly set up a makeshift isolation area, using boxes and clean blankets to separate the puppies. Her movements were precise, her focus sharp, but her thoughts raced with unanswered questions. Sophie stood frozen, her face pale. This is my fault, she whispered. I should have noticed something was wrong sooner. I should have. Sophie, Karen said, her voice firm but kind. This isn't your fault. Maya needs us to stay calm and focused. Can you help me keep the towels coming? Sophie hesitated, then nodded. Her hands trembled as she reached for another towel. The night dragged on. Karen worked tirelessly, cleaning the puppy's lesions and documenting their symptoms on her phone. Every so often, she searched for answers online, but nothing fit. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, Karen finally sat back on her heels. Her back ached and exhaustion tugged at her, but the immediate crisis had passed. The puppies were stable, their tiny bodies warm and clean in their isolation spaces. Maya, though weak, had stayed strong through it all. She nuzzled each puppy before Karen moved them to safety. Karen let out a shaky breath, her eyes scanning the room. The hardest part was over, or so she thought, because deep down, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The first light of dawn crept through Sophie's living room, casting long shadows on the walls. Karen knelt beside Maya, her back aching from hours of tension. The puppies lay in their makeshift isolation area, each one bundled in a clean towel. Their tiny bodies looked so fragile, their fur matted with birth fluids and dotted with those disturbing red lesions. Karen tried not to let her worry show. They made it through the night, Sophie whispered, her voice hoarse. She stood nearby, clutching a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Karen nodded, glancing over at Maya. The German Shepherd was exhausted but alert, her dark eyes watching Karen's every move. Her tail thumped weakly against the floor as Karen reached over to stroke her head. You did so well, girl, Karen murmured. But the uneasy feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. She carefully unwrapped one of the puppies to examine it more closely. The lesions looked even angrier in the daylight, and Karen noticed a faint, unusual smell coming from its fur. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, snapping pictures of the marks and making notes. What's wrong with them? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen hesitated. I don't know yet, she admitted. It could be a skin infection or something else entirely. We'll need to run tests to be sure. Sophie's face crumpled. I should have done more, she said, tears welling in her eyes. Maybe if I'd called earlier, or if I'd taken better care of Maya. Sophie, Karen said gently, interrupting her spiral of guilt. You did the best you could. What matters now is that we focus on helping them. Sophie nodded, wiping her eyes. Karen glanced back at her phone, scrolling through search results for possible causes. None of the answers felt right. The lesions, the smell, the unusual exhaustion, it didn't add up. She felt a growing sense of dread, but she pushed it aside. There wasn't time to panic. I'll need to check on them again in a few hours, Karen said. For now, Maya needs rest, and so do you. Sophie opened her mouth to argue, but Karen shook her head. You've been up all night, she said firmly. Go get some sleep. I'll stay here with her. Reluctantly, Sophie shuffled off to the bedroom. Karen turned her attention back to Maya and the puppies. Her notebook sat open beside her, filled with hurried scribbles from the night before. Possible causes, symptoms, treatment options. None of it felt like enough. Maya let out a soft whimper, and Karen stroked her head again. It's okay, girl, she said. We'll figure this out. The quiet moment was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Karen's heart jumped, the sound cutting through the stillness like a knife. She glanced toward the hallway where Sophie had disappeared. Another knock followed, louder this time. Karen stood slowly, her muscles tense. She moved to the window and peeked through the curtain. A man stood on the porch. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his fists clenched at his sides. His face was hard, his jaw set in a way that made Karen's stomach churn. Karen didn't need Sophie to tell her who he was. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door just enough to step into the frame, blocking his view of the house. "Can I help you?" Karen asked, her voice steady despite the unease twisting inside her. The man's eyes narrowed. "Where's my dog?" he demanded. "Where's my dog?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Karen kept her expression neutral. "Maya just had emergency surgery," she said evenly. "She's in critical condition and can't be moved." "You're lying," Dale growled, stepping closer. Karen stood her ground. "Moving her now could kill her and the puppies. If you care about her, you'll leave her alone to recover." Dale's face reddened with anger. He tried to push past Karen, but she planted her feet firmly, refusing to budge. "Get out of my way," he snarled. "No," Karen said, her voice steel. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here." For a tense moment, neither of them moved. Dale's fists twitched at his sides, his anger barely contained. Finally, he stepped back, a cruel smile curling his lips. "Fine," he said. "Play it your way. But remember, I know people in this town. Cross me, and you'll regret it." He jabbed a finger toward Karen before stalking off to his truck. Karen watched him go, her muscles tense until the sound of his engine faded into the distance. Only then did she close the door and turn the deadbolt. In the kitchen, Sophie had collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. "He's never going to stop," she sobbed. "He'll keep coming back until he gets Maya." Karen placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Not if we stop him first," she said, her voice firm with determination. Sophie looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "How?" Karen pulled out her phone and began typing. "First, we document everything. Maya's injuries, the puppy's condition, everything you've told me about Dale. Then I'm going to make some calls." "To who?" Sophie asked. Karen didn't look up. "To the people who can help us fight back." The next morning, Karen sat at her kitchen table, her notebook open and phone buzzing with notifications. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, but her mind was anything but still. Her pen flew across the page as she documented every detail from the night before. Maya's injuries, the puppy's strange lesions, Dale's threats. She had photos, notes, and timelines, everything she could think of to build a case. Sophie sat across from her, staring at her mug of tea. She hadn't touched it. "Do you think this will be enough?" she asked quietly. Karen glanced up. "It's a start," she said, "but we need more. I need to find out exactly who we're dealing with." She opened her laptop, typing Dale Parker's name into the search bar. The results were a mix of vague social media profiles, local news articles, and public records. Karen's military training had taught her how to sift through noise to find what mattered, and she dug in with methodical focus. "What are you looking for?" Sophie asked, her voice hesitant. "Patterns," Karen replied. "Connections. Anything that tells me how far his influence goes." After an hour of searching, Karen's stomach turned as the pieces began to fall into place. There were complaints of animal cruelty linked to Dale's name, none of which led to charges. A series of suspicious fires at properties owned by people who'd tried to report him, and whispers of dogfighting rings operating just under the radar. She tapped her pen against the table, her jaw tightening. "This isn't just about Maya," she muttered. "He's part of something bigger." Sophie's face paled. "What do we do?" Karen didn't answer immediately. She was already scrolling through her contacts, searching for a name she hadn't called in years. "Marcus Dean," Karen said, dialing the number. "Who's that?" Sophie asked. "An animal control officer," Karen explained. "He's one of the good ones." After a few rings, a deep professional voice answered. "Animal Control Officer Dean speaking." "Marcus, it's Karen Elliott," she said, keeping her tone steady. There was a brief pause before he replied. "Karen, it's been a while." "I need your help," Karen said. "I've got a case of animal abuse and suspected illegal breeding, and it's bad." She laid out everything, the puppies, the lesions, Dale's threats, and the evidence she'd gathered. Marcus listened in silence, only interrupting to ask for clarification. "These are serious allegations," he said finally, And Dale Parker, he's not someone to take lightly. I know, Karen said firmly, but I have documentation, photos, medical notes, witnesses. Marcus hesitated. It's a solid start, but you'll need more if you want to take him down. Dale has connections, friends in law enforcement even. He's slippery. Karen's grip on the phone tightened. So what do we do? Marcus sighed. Meet me at Miller's Diner in an hour. Bring everything you've got. When the call ended, Karen turned to Sophie. We're not alone in this, she said. Marcus will help us, but we need to be smart. Sophie nodded, though her hands were still trembling. What if it's not enough? What if he finds out what we're doing? Karen leaned forward, her eyes sharp. Then we'll be ready, but I need you to trust me. An hour later, Karen slid into a booth at the diner, her bag stuffed with notes and photos. Marcus arrived right on time, his uniform crisp and his expression guarded. He looked younger than she remembered, but his kind eyes hadn't changed. Show me what you got, he said, getting straight to the point. Karen spread the evidence across the table. Photos of Maya's injuries, medical charts for the puppies, and screenshots of articles linking Dale to dogfighting operations. She spoke with the precision of someone trained to present facts under pressure, laying out each piece of information like coordinates on a map. Marcus studied the evidence carefully, his coffee growing cold beside him. This is thorough work, he said, looking up at Karen. But Dale Parker isn't just another backyard breeder. He's dangerous. And if we're going to take him down, we have to be smart. Karen nodded. Tell me what we need to do. Marcus leaned back, running a hand through his hair. First, we keep gathering evidence. We need something so undeniable that even his connections can't help him. And then, Karen asked. Then, Marcus said, his voice firm, we take him down. Karen left the diner with a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like they had a chance. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across Karen's kitchen as she spread a series of satellite images across the table. Each one showed Dale Parker's property, its fences, outbuildings, and blind spots. Karen studied them with the same focus she'd once given to mission maps during her time in the military. This is his main house, Marcus said, pointing to the largest structure. The kennels are out back. My source says the dogfights usually happen in this barn. He tapped a smaller building near the edge of the property. Karen nodded, her mind already forming a plan. And the security? Marcus sighed. Dale has lookouts, armed ones. He's paranoid and careful, but if we catch him during an event, we'll have enough evidence to shut him down for good. Sophie sat silently at the corner of the table, her hands clasped tightly around a mug. What happens if something goes wrong? She asked, her voice small. Karen glanced at her, her expression firm. We don't think about that. We prepare. We're not going to let him get away with this. Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice. Karen, I need to ask, are you sure you're up for this? It's dangerous. Karen's jaw tightened. I've been through worse, she said. We need to stop him, Marcus. No one else is going to. He nodded, though his face was etched with concern. The rest of the evening was spent finalizing the plan. Marcus would lead a team of trusted officers to secure the property, while Karen would document everything, the conditions, the dogs, the fights. Every photo and video would be another nail in Dale's coffin. Sophie cleared her throat, breaking the heavy silence. I want to help, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Karen shook her head. It's too dangerous. But I know him, Sophie argued. I know his habits, his routines. I've seen the cars that come and go. That has to count for something. Karen hesitated, weighing the risk. Finally, she nodded. All right, but you stay in the car and you do exactly what Marcus tells you. Sophie nodded, relief washing over her face. By the time they finished, it was well past midnight. Karen stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. Somewhere out there, Dale was planning his next fight, oblivious to the storm heading his way. You should get some rest, Marcus said from behind her. Karen shook her head. I'll rest when this is over. The next morning, Karen sat in the quiet of her garden, trying to center herself. Her hands moved mechanically as she packed her gear, a small high-definition camera, a notebook, and a flashlight. Each item reminded her of a different mission, a different battlefield. But this time, the enemy wasn't across the ocean. Sophie arrived carrying a bag of supplies. "I brought snacks," she said awkwardly, setting them on the table. Karen managed a small smile. "Thanks. Do you think we can really do this?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We don't have a choice. Those dogs are counting on us." That evening, Marcus's truck rolled to a stop a few blocks away from Dale's property. The air was heavy with tension as Karen, Sophie, and Marcus huddled for a final briefing. "We'll move in once we confirm activity," Marcus said. "Stay low, stay quiet, and don't take risks." Karen nodded, her grip tightening on the camera in her hands. "Let's do this." The group moved silently through the dark, the only sounds their careful footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. As they approached the property, the faint sound of barking and shouting reached their ears. Karen's stomach churned. They stopped near the tree line, crouching in the shadows. From their vantage point, Karen could see the barn lit up, shadows moving inside. "It's happening," Marcus whispered. Karen raised her camera, focusing on the barn. Through the lens, she could make out dogs in cages, some barking frantically while others lay motionless. Men stood in clusters, exchanging money and shouting as a fight began in the makeshift ring. Her hands shook as she documented everything. The scars on the dogs, the blood-stained floor, the cruelty on the faces of the men. "We've seen enough," Marcus said, signaling his team. Karen stayed in place as the officers moved in, her camera still trained on the scene. The shouts inside the barn turned to chaos as doors burst open and officers swarmed the property. Dale's voice cut through the noise, furious and defiant. "You have no right to be here." Karen turned her camera toward him just as he lunged for a nearby rifle. Her heart leapt into her throat. "Drop the weapon!" Marcus shouted. Dale ignored him, raising the rifle toward one of the officers. Without thinking, Karen moved. Her military training kicked in as she darted forward, grabbing the barrel and shoving it skyward. The gun went off with a deafening crack, but the shot hit nothing but air. Karen twisted the rifle from Dale's grip and swept his legs, sending him crashing to the ground. Officers rushed in, pinning him down and slapping cuffs on his wrists. "It's over," Marcus said, his voice steady. Karen stepped back, her chest heaving. The adrenaline coursing through her veins began to fade, replaced by a wave of exhaustion. "Nah." She looked around at the dogs being freed from their cages, their tails wagging hesitantly as officers led them to safety. It wasn't over, not yet, but for the first time, Karen felt like they were winning. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. Karen sat on the tailgate of Marcus's truck, her body aching and her mind heavy with everything they'd witnessed. Around her, the scene was chaotic but purposeful. Officers moved back and forth, cataloging evidence and loading the rescued dogs into waiting vehicles. Their barking filled the air, a mixture of fear and relief as they were freed from their cages. Karen rubbed her temples, exhaustion seeping into her bones. The adrenaline that had kept her sharp during the raid was gone, leaving her drained. Marcus approached, his expression a mix of triumph and concern. "How are you holding up?" he asked, offering her a bottle of water. Karen took it with a nod. "Tired," she admitted, twisting off the cap and taking a long sip. "You did good tonight," Marcus said, his voice steady. "If it wasn't for you, Dale might have gotten away with this. Again." Karen shook her head, staring at the ground. "It's not enough," she said quietly. "There are more out there. More Dales, more dogs suffering, and we only saved the ones we could reach." Marcus crouched down, meeting her eyes. "It's a start," he said firmly. "You can't save everyone, Karen, but you saved these ones, and that matters." Karen's gaze shifted to the rescued dogs, their tired but hopeful eyes glinting in the morning light. For the first time, a small flicker of pride warmed her chest. Later that morning, Karen returned home, the weight of the night still pressing on her shoulders. She stepped inside her house, the familiar quiet feeling heavier than usual. Maya and her puppies greeted her at the door, their tails wagging weakly. Karen knelt down, letting them nuzzle her hands. You're safe now, she murmured, her voice soft. All of you. She carried the smallest puppy to the couch and sat with him nestled in her lap. His tiny warm body was a reminder of why she'd done what she had. But the images of the raid still lingered in her mind. The scars, the blood, the fear etched into the dog's eyes. Sophie arrived not long after, her face pale but determined. She carried a basket of fresh bandages and supplies, setting them on the table before sitting beside Karen. "How are you feeling?" Sophie asked hesitantly. Karen managed a small smile. "Exhausted," she admitted. Sophie nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. "I've been thinking about everything you've done for Maya, for me, for those dogs. You didn't have to help, but you did." Karen glanced at her, unsure of what to say. "I've never been brave," Sophie continued. "Not until I met you. But now I want to help more. I don't want to just watch from the sidelines anymore." Karen set the puppy down gently, turning to face Sophie. "What are you saying?" Sophie took a deep breath. "I think we should do something more permanent. A place where animals like Maya can heal, somewhere they're safe." Karen blinked, the words settling over her like a warm blanket. "You mean a sanctuary?" "Yes," Sophie said, her voice growing stronger. "You have the skills and I want to help. We could make it happen." Karen stared at her, the weight of the idea both daunting and exhilarating. "A sanctuary," she repeated, her mind already racing with possibilities. Sophie nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "It could be more than just a safe place. It could be a second chance for the animals and for people like us." Karen's chest tightened. She thought of the dogs they'd rescued, the lives they'd changed, and the purpose she'd found in helping them. For the first time in a long time, Karen felt a spark of hope. That afternoon, Karen sat at her kitchen table, a notebook in front of her. She scribbled ideas, crossing some out and circling others. Across from her, Sophie flipped through online listings for properties large enough to house a sanctuary. "This one has 5 acres, Sophie said, holding up her laptop. "It's not far from town, and there's an old barn we could convert into kennels." Karen leaned over to look. The property was overgrown and rough around the edges, but it had potential. "It's a start," Karen said with a small smile. Sophie grinned. "We'll make it work." By the time the sun set, the two women had a list of contacts to call: local veterinarians, contractors, and animal welfare organizations. Karen had already left messages for Marcus, knowing his experience would be invaluable. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Karen sat back in her chair, her mind still buzzing. "You really think we can do this?" Sophie asked. Karen looked at her, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. "I think we already are." Maya trotted over, her tail wagging as she nudged Karen's hand. Karen reached down, scratching the dog's ears. "Second chances," Karen murmured, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "For all of us." The first rays of morning light filtered through the trees as Karen pulled her truck into the overgrown driveway. The property Sophie had found was sprawling, 5 acres of untamed land, bordered by a dense line of trees. It wasn't much to look at. The barn was weathered, its paint peeling, and the house was little more than a creaky farmhouse with sagging steps. But to Karen, it was full of potential. "This is it," Sophie said from the passenger seat, her voice brimming with excitement. "Our sanctuary." Karen stepped out of the truck, her boots crunching against the gravel. She surveyed the land, her mind already envisioning what it could become. Kennels, play yards, a medical area. It would take work, but she could see it all. "It's going to take everything we have," Karen said, glancing at Sophie. Sophie smiled, determination shining in her eyes. "Then we'll give it everything we've got." 2 weeks later, the property buzzed with activity. Trucks carrying lumber and supplies rolled down the driveway, and volunteers bustled around the site. Karen stood near the barn, watching as Marcus marked out the area for the first kennel. "This spot gets good shade in the afternoons," he said, pointing to the trees nearby. "It'll keep the dogs cool in the summer." Karen nodded, jotting down notes in her notebook. "Good. Let's make sure there's enough space for them to run, too." Nearby, Sophie was unloading a stack of fencing material with a group of volunteers. Her hands were dirty, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, but she looked happier than Karen had ever seen her. "Watch your footing," Sophie called out, guiding a volunteer who was struggling with a heavy roll of wire. Karen smiled to herself. Sophie had come a long way from the nervous woman who'd first knocked on her door. By midday, the air was thick with the smell of sawdust and fresh dirt. The sound of hammers and drills echoed across the property as the framework for the first kennel took shape. Karen worked alongside the volunteers, her muscles aching as she helped secure posts and assemble fencing. Sweat dripped down her brow, but she didn't mind. Every step forward felt like a victory. During a break, Marcus handed her a bottle of water. "How's it feeling?" he asked, gesturing to the progress around them. Karen took a long drink before answering. "Like we're building something that matters," she said, her voice steady. Marcus smiled. "You are." As the sun began to set, the group gathered around a makeshift table set up in the shade of the barn. Sophie had brought sandwiches and lemonade, and the volunteers ate with the kind of exhaustion that only came from a hard day's work. Karen leaned against the barn door, watching the group with a mix of pride and gratitude. "You've all done incredible work today," she said, her voice carrying over the quiet hum of conversation. "This place wouldn't be possible without you." The volunteers clapped and cheered, their enthusiasm lifting Karen's spirits. Sophie stood, raising her glass of lemonade. "To Elliot's Refuge," she said, her voice strong. "A place for second chances, for the animals, and for all of us." The group echoed her toast, their voices ringing out as the sun dipped below the horizon. That night, Karen sat on the porch of the farmhouse, a warm cup of tea cradled in her hands. The land was quiet now, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Maya lay at her feet, her head resting on her paws. Karen reached down, scratching behind the dog's ears. "We're really doing this," she murmured. Maya thumped her tail in response, her eyes glinting in the soft moonlight. Karen thought about the dogs they'd saved during the raid, the lives they were building this sanctuary to protect. It was overwhelming, but for the first time in years, she felt like she had a purpose again. "This is just the beginning," Karen whispered, her voice firm with resolve. Over the following weeks, Elliot's Refuge began to take shape. The old barn was cleaned and repurposed into a medical area, complete with kennels for recovering animals. The open fields were fenced off to create play areas, and the farmhouse was transformed into an administrative space. Karen worked tirelessly, managing construction and coordinating with volunteers. Marcus handled permits and logistics, while Sophie became the heart of their fundraising efforts. One afternoon, Sophie burst into the barn, her face glowing with excitement. "We got the grant!" she exclaimed, waving a letter in the air. Karen looked up from her clipboard, a rare smile breaking across her face. "That's incredible," she said. "It's enough to cover the rest of the construction," Sophie said, practically bouncing with joy. "And we can start taking in animals by next month." Karen's chest swelled with pride. They were doing it. On the first day of operations, the sanctuary was filled with life. Volunteers greeted the first animals, abandoned dogs, injured strays, and scared puppies, bringing them into their new home. Karen watched as one particularly timid dog, a skinny shepherd mix, stepped tentatively into its kennel. It glanced back at her, its tail wagging hesitantly. "You're safe now," Karen whispered. Nearby, Sophie was giving a tour to a group of donors, her confidence shining as she spoke about the sanctuary's mission. Marcus stood by the gate, directing a group of volunteers unloading supplies. For the first time in a long time, Karen felt a deep sense of peace. Elliot's Refuge wasn't just a sanctuary for animals, it was a place of healing for everyone who walked through its gates. The grand opening of Elliot's Refuge was a day Karen would never forget. The morning sun bathed the property in a golden glow, and a gentle breeze rustled the trees lining the 5-acre sanctuary. Volunteers bustled about, setting up tents and tables while the sound of laughter and barking filled the air. Karen stood near the welcome banner, her clipboard in hand. The freshly painted buildings gleamed in the sunlight, the kennels were spotless, and the play areas were ready for their new residents. She took a deep breath, her heart swelling with pride. "This is it," Sophie said, walking up beside her. She held a tray of muffins, her expression a mix of excitement and nerves. "The big day." Karen nodded, her grip tightening on the clipboard. "We've come a long way." Sophie smiled, nudging her shoulder. "And it's only the beginning." By mid-morning, families began arriving. Children ran ahead, eager to see the animals, while parents stopped to admire the sanctuary's setup. Karen greeted each visitor warmly, handing out pamphlets that explained their mission, a safe haven for animals in need, and a second chance for all who sought one. The play areas became a hub of activity. Dogs ran free, tails wagging as they explored the grassy fields. Volunteers introduced visitors to the sanctuary's residents, sharing stories of rescue and recovery. Maya and her puppies were the stars of the day. Now healthy and full of energy, the puppies romped around their enclosure, delighting the crowd. Maya watched over them with calm eyes, occasionally wagging her tail as children approached to pet her. "She's incredible," a woman said, watching Maya from the edge of the pen. Karen smiled. "She's a survivor," she said, "and she's the reason we're here." Near the barn, Sophie led a tour group through the sanctuary's facilities. Her voice carried a confidence Karen hadn't heard before as she explained the purpose of each area. "This is our medical building," Sophie said, gesturing to the converted barn. "We use it to treat injured animals and help them recover before they are ready for adoption." One man raised his hand. "How many animals can you take in at once?" "We're starting with 20, Sophie replied. "But with your support, we hope to expand and help even more." The group clapped, and Sophie's cheeks flushed with pride. Karen watched from a distance, her heart full. Sophie had grown so much since that first night she'd knocked on Karen's door. She wasn't just a partner in this mission, she was a leader. At the main tent, Marcus managed a steady flow of donations and signups. Businesses pledged supplies, families signed up to volunteer, and donors wrote checks that would help sustain the sanctuary in its early days. Karen joined him, her clipboard now filled with names and notes. "How's it looking?" she asked. Marcus grinned. "Better than I hoped," he said. "If this keeps up, we'll be able to expand sooner than we thought." Karen exhaled, relief washing over her. "Good. We'll need all the help we can get." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression serious. "You've done something amazing here, Karen. Don't forget that." She nodded, though her throat tightened with emotion. "It's not just me," she said quietly. "It's all of us." As the day went on, Karen found herself drawn to a young couple standing near the kennels. They were watching one of the sanctuary's newest residents, a shy shepherd mix named Rusty. "He's beautiful," the woman said, her voice soft. Karen approached them with a warm smile. "Rusty's come a long way," she said. "He was terrified of people when he first arrived, but he's starting to trust again." The man crouched down, extending his hand toward the dog. Rusty sniffed it cautiously, then gave a tentative wag of his tail. Karen's heart swelled. Moments like this were what Elliot's Refuge was all about, helping animals find the love and safety they deserved. "Would you like to meet him properly?" Karen asked. The couple exchanged a look before nodding eagerly. Karen opened the kennel, letting Rusty step out. He stayed close to her at first, but the couple's gentle demeanor soon put him at ease. By the time they left, they'd filled out an adoption application, and Rusty had a new family waiting for him. As the event wound down, Karen took a moment to sit on a bench near the play yard. The sounds of the day still lingered: laughter, excited chatter, and the joyful barks of dogs discovering freedom. Sophie joined her, holding 2 cups of lemonade. "How are you feeling?" she asked, handing Karen one. "Tired," Karen admitted, sipping the drink. "But good, really good." Sophie nodded, her gaze sweeping across the sanctuary. "We did it," she said softly. Karen smiled, the weight of the past few months finally lifting. "Yeah," she said. "We did." Maya trotted over, her tail wagging as she rested her head on Karen's knee. Karen reached down, scratching behind her ears. "This place wouldn't exist without you, girl," Karen murmured. Maya thumped her tail, as if she understood. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the sanctuary in a warm golden light. For the first time in years, Karen felt truly at peace. Elliot's Refuge wasn't just a sanctuary for animals. It was a testament to the power of second chances, for the animals they saved, for the people who helped them, and for Karen herself. 1 year later, Elliot's Refuge was thriving. The once overgrown property had been transformed into a bustling sanctuary with neatly built kennels, wide-open play areas, and a newly completed education center. The air was filled with the sounds of happy barks, playful yips, and the occasional meow from the sanctuary's newest feline residents. Karen stood in the center of it all, clipboard in hand, overseeing the preparations for the sanctuary's one-year anniversary celebration. Volunteers carried tables and decorations, their laughter blending with the lively atmosphere. "This looks amazing," Sophie said as she approached, her arms full of bright sunflowers for the registration table. She had grown into her role as operations manager, her once timid demeanor replaced by confidence and purpose. Karen smiled. "It's hard to believe how far we've come." "And it's just the beginning," Sophie said, placing the flowers in a vase. By mid-morning, the sanctuary was buzzing with activity. Families, donors, and supporters strolled through the grounds, meeting the animals and learning about Elliot's refuge. Karen walked among them, stopping to answer questions and share stories. She passed the kennels where a group of children were playing with Maya and her puppies, now fully grown and thriving in their forever homes. "Maya's a hero," a little girl said, scratching behind the German Shepherd's ears. "She really is," Karen replied, her voice warm. Near the education center, Marcus stood with a group of local students, teaching them about animal care and welfare. He held up a chart showing the proper way to approach a scared dog. The kids listened intently, their faces lighting up when he brought out a gentle Labrador for a demonstration. "Remember," Marcus said, his voice carrying over the crowd, "every animal deserves a chance to feel safe and loved." Karen watched him with a mixture of pride and gratitude. Marcus's support had been instrumental in getting Elliot's refuge off the ground, and his passion for the mission shone through in everything he did. As the day progressed, Karen found herself drawn to the adoption area, where potential families were meeting the sanctuary's newest residents. She spotted a young boy sitting quietly beside a hound mix named Bella. The dog was shy, her tail tucked, but the boy's calm demeanor seemed to put her at ease. "Is she scared?" the boy asked as Karen approached. "A little," Karen said, kneeling beside him. "She's been through a lot, but she's brave, just like you." The boy smiled, reaching out to pet Bella. Her tail gave a tentative wag, and Karen felt a familiar warmth in her chest. Moments like these were the reason she'd fought so hard to build this place. As the sun began to set, the crowd gathered near the main tent for the closing ceremony. Karen stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edges as she looked out at the sea of faces. "When we started Elliot's Refuge a year ago," she began, her voice steady, "I had no idea how much it would change my life. This place was meant to be a sanctuary for animals in need, but it's become so much more than that." She glanced at Sophie and Marcus, who stood near the front of the crowd, their expressions full of pride. "It's become a place of healing," Karen continued, her voice thick with emotion. "For the animals we've saved, for the people who've supported us, and for me." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "Every life we save, every second chance we give, is because of all of you. Your kindness, your generosity, and your belief in this mission have made this possible." The crowd erupted into applause and Karen stepped back, her heart full. After the ceremony, Karen wandered the grounds, taking in the joyful energy around her. Volunteers chatted with visitors, families played with newly adopted pets, and the air buzzed with hope and possibility. Sophie found her near the play yard, holding a cup of lemonade. "You did it," she said, handing Karen the drink. Karen smiled, her eyes glistening. "We did it." They sat on a nearby bench, watching the dogs romp through the grass. Maya lay nearby, her eyes half closed as she enjoyed the cool evening breeze. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" Sophie asked. Karen nodded, her mind drifting back to that first night Sophie had knocked on her door, desperate for help. It felt like a lifetime ago. "I think about it all the time," Karen said softly. "It reminds me why we keep going." Sophie smiled, resting her head on Karen's shoulder. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Karen stood near the sanctuary's entrance, watching the last of the visitors leave. The anniversary celebration had been a success, but her work was far from over. Maya trotted up beside her, leaning against her leg. Karen reached down, scratching behind her ears. "This is just the beginning," she murmured. She looked out at the sanctuary, the lights glowing softly against the dark backdrop of trees. It wasn't just a place for animals. It was a place for people to find hope, purpose, and healing. And for Karen, it was home.